Barefoot 15. Cast out in the snow, the Alpha exiled her for feeding starving pups. 63 wolves watched in silence. Not one spoke her name. In a brutal kingdom ruled by fang and blood oath, her father's debt became her chains. Her kindness became her crime. But the rogue mountains hide an ancient law, a bloodline the eastern packs hunted to extinction 3 generations ago. A moon Luna, the last of her kind. Her mother whispered it once in the dark. Run north, never east. She never knew why. 200 miles away, an Alpha King lifts his head into the wind. 9 days he walks. Wolves climb the mountain at dawn. The exiled Alpha returns with 30 warriors. The oven still burns. Her hands do not shake. He kneels in the snow. May I stay? The morning Astrid Vesna was driven from Stalfung territory. The frost had already turned the courtyard stones into something harder than rock. Winter had come early to the northern range that year, the kind that did not knock, the kind that walked through walls. She stood barefoot in oversized boots that had once belonged to a warrior twice her size, 15 years old, a thin cotton dress hanging from her shoulders like an afterthought. Her hair tied back with a strip of leather she had cut from an old bridle in the stable 2 summers ago. Everything she owned was inside a canvas sack the size of a loaf of bread. The cold found her first, before the wolves, before the Alpha, before the verdict. It slipped under the hem of her dress and curled around her ribs the way a stray cat curls into a barn it does not yet trust. Smoke drifted from the chimneys of the pack house behind her, the smell of cooked venison, fresh bread, butter melting on a cast iron. She had risen before dawn to prepare that breakfast. She had stirred the porridge with her own hand and she would not taste a single bite. Alpha Borak Stalf stood on the wide porch above the courtyard, broad shoulders, dark hair shot through with silver at the temples, the kind of presence that bent the air around him without permission. His golden eyes did not blink in the cold. They never did. He rested one heavy hand on the porch railing. The wolves of Stalfang had gathered along the stone walls to watch. Warriors, mates, children peeking from behind their mothers' skirts. 63 pairs of eyes. Astrid had counted them once last summer on a quiet evening when she could not sleep. 63. And not one of them would speak for her now. His voice carried across the courtyard like a flat stone skipped across still water. You were taken into this pack out of obligation. She kept her eyes on her boots. 2 years of survival had taught her that silence was a kind of armor, thinner than wool, stronger than steel. Sometimes your father owed Stalfang coin and labor, a murmur from the warriors. Debt. The pack treated it like scripture. You did not break a debt. You buried it. Or you became it. Since he died before paying it, you were allowed to remain here as settlement. Allowed. That word landed harder than the cold. Allowed. As though her childhood had been a favor. As though the 2 years she had scrubbed floors and hauled water and split firewood at 14 had been a courtesy extended by a kind man. She thought of her father then, Mikhail Vesna with ink on his fingers and pine needles caught in his hair. The man who had read aloud to her by lamplight until the words on the page blurred from her tears of laughter. The man who had taught her that knowledge was the only kind of power no Alpha could take. She thought of Sigrid, her mother's hands moving through flour the way other women moved through prayer. Borak's voice cut across the memory. An Omega who cannot serve the pack has no place in it. A few heads nodded along the wall. Others looked at the snow. The cold made everyone honest in their small ways. She tightened her grip on the canvas sack. Inside it, 2 books. Her father's field journal and a worn copy of mountain plants and their uses, a paring knife wrapped in oiled leather, a dented tin cup, a photograph of her mother under the dogwood tree behind their old cabin, laughing at something the camera did not catch. That was the inventory of her life. It weighed less than a loaf of bread. Forks straightened. Leave Stalfang territory by nightfall. The wind shifted. It carried the scent of pine and snow down from the high passes. Somewhere a child started crying and was hushed quickly by a mother who did not want the Alpha to look in her direction. If you are still within our borders at dusk, you will be treated as a rogue. Rogue, the word every pack wolf was taught to fear before they were taught to read. He paused. He looked at her the way a man looks at a stain on a floor he no longer intends to clean. Be grateful you are being allowed to walk. There it was again. Allowed. She lifted her head just enough to see past him, past the porch, past the smoke, to the northern ridges rising blue and cruel against the gray morning sky. Wild land, rogue land, no pack laws, no alphas, no allowed. She did not feel fear when she looked at those mountains. She felt distance. Distance from this courtyard. Distance from 63 pairs of silent eyes. Distance from the man on the porch who had decided her life was a debt he could close with a sentence. She turned. The wolves parted to let her pass, some out of courtesy, most out of a particular kind of relief. Out of sight, out of the conversation tonight at dinner, her oversized boots made a hollow sound against the frozen ground. The padding inside them had flattened months ago. Each step felt like walking on a wooden drum. Behind her, the door of the pack house creaked open. Warm air spilled out. Someone laughed at something inside. Already the morning was returning to its rhythm. Already her name was beginning to slip out of the building like steam. She did not look back. Not once. Have you ever been judged by people who never bothered to learn your story? People who decided what you were worth before you had the chance to show them. Imagine being 15. Imagine being barefoot in boots. Imagine the only person who would have spoken for you being buried under an ash tree 2 winters ago. That was the morning Astrid Vesna walked out of Stalfang Pack. The mountain was waiting, and the mountain did not care how she got there. The trail north of the courtyard ran along a low ridge where the wind had stripped the snow into hard ribbons. She walked. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that tears were a luxury you paid for with energy you did not always have. By the time the smoke of the pack house was no longer visible behind her, her fingers had stopped feeling like fingers. They felt like wood. She switched the canvas sack from one hand to the other every few minutes to keep both hands moving. Her father had taught her that a long time ago on a summer hike. Back when summer was a thing she trusted, the cabin where she had grown up had stood at the edge of the Grerad forest, where the Stalfang territory thinned into wilder ground. Cedar boards weathered to the color of old bone. A stone chimney built by Mikhail with his own hands the year she was born. He used to point at the rocks in the wall and tell her which creek he had pulled each one from. She had known the geography of her own fireplace before she had the geography of her own pack. Inside the cabin had been a kind of light that did not come from the lamps. It came from the shelves. Field guides, notebooks bound in cracked leather, jars of dried things on the windowsills with her father's careful handwriting on the labels. Yarrow, pine pitch, sphagnum. He had been a scientist. He had been a wolf, yes, but his real religion had been observation. He used to take her by hand and lead her into the forest, as if the forest were a library, and the trees were the spines of books. Every land has a language, little one. That had been one of his favorite sentences. She had been 9 when he first said it to her. The autumn light had been low and gold, and the forest had smelled of wet leaves and something sweet underneath. He had knelt in front of a cluster of small white mushrooms on a fallen log. His hand had been so steady, so patient. The language of survival, he had told her. The plants tell you where the water runs under the ground. The clouds tell you when the storms will come. The animals tell you where the land is safe. She had asked him then how the plants could speak. He had smiled at her. He had not laughed. He had never laughed at her questions. He had told her that plants did not speak with sound. They spoke with shape, with color, with the company they kept. You learned their language by watching where they chose to live. She had remembered all of it, every word. If Mikhail had given her curiosity, Sigrid had given her warmth and something else, something she had not yet learned to name. Sigrid had understood food the way some people understood music. Their kitchen had always smelled alive, bunches of herbs drying from the rafters, broth on the stove that simmered so slowly it seemed to think before it moved, bread under a cloth in a wooden bowl. The yeast in that bowl had been older than Astrid. It was older still. Sigrid had let her stand on a wooden crate beside the counter when she was small, flour up to the wrists. Her mother had a particular way of pressing the dough with the heel of her left hand. It was not the way the other women in the pack needed. It came from somewhere else. Somewhere her mother had never named. Flavor is memory, Sigrid had told her once. Astrid had been 7. She had asked what that meant. Her mother had folded the dough over itself in one slow motion and answered, "It means when a wolf tastes something wonderful, they remember how it made them feel." And wolves remember feelings longer than they remember words. Their family had lived slightly apart from the pack, not by exile, by choice, by the quiet difference of people who valued curiosity and kindness in a place that valued dominance and clear hierarchy. The other wolves had treated her parents with a kind of distant politeness, the way a man treats a neighbor whose religion he does not quite understand but does not wish to insult. Then there had been the night of the whisper. She had been 10 or 11. The exact age had blurred. The memory had not. She had been in bed in the small room off the kitchen, half asleep. The fire in the main room had burned low. She had heard her parents talking in the way adults talk when they think the children cannot hear. Low, careful, words stretched thin so they would not crack. Her mother's voice, soft as breath on a window. If they ever come looking, Mikhail, she must run on north, not east. Promise me. Her father's voice, slower, heavier. Something underneath it she had never heard before. No one will come looking. Not here. Not after this long. Promise me, Mikhail. Promise me she goes north. A long silence. The fire had popped once. Her father had answered, I promise. Astrid had not understood the words. She had understood the shape of them. The way her mother's voice had bent around them like someone curling protectively over a small wound. She had stored the moment in her chest and gone back to sleep. She had never asked about it. Not once. Not in the years that followed. Now she walked north out of Stalfang territory. North, not east. Her feet were following an instruction she could not remember receiving. The sickness had come in the winter she turned 13. It had begun as whispers between the pack houses. A fever in the lower valley. A cough that did not respond to the usual remedies. Wolves dropping during a hunt and not getting up. Her father had filled the pages of his field journal with frantic notes, cross-references, drawings of the rash that bloomed along the inside of the arm in the second week. He had not slept much. He had kept telling her mother he was close. He had been close to something. He had not been close enough. He had been the first in their household to fall. She remembered the exact moment in his heartbeat had stopped. The silence afterward had felt heavier than the mountain. 8 days later, the sickness had taken Sigrid. She had been so quiet at the end. She had reached for Astrid's hand. She had not said anything. She had not needed to. The pack had buried them quickly under the ash tree on the hill above the cabin. Winter winds had whipped across the slope. Some wolves had offered condolences. Most had simply watched. When the grave was filled, they had drifted away one by one. And Astrid had stood there until the sky began to darken, and her hands had stopped feeling. When she had finally walked back to the cabin that night, the silence inside had been the worst sound she had ever heard. Her father's books had stood in their neat rows on the shelves. Her mother's wooden spoons had hung on their nails above the stove. Everything was exactly where it belonged, except them. She had walked into the kitchen without thinking. The fire had burned low in the hearth. On the counter had stood the glass jar that held the sourdough starter her mother had kept alive since before Astrid was born. The mixture inside had bubbled faintly, a small, slow heartbeat. She had stared at it for a long time. Then she had reached for the flour tin. She had added a handful, then water. She had stirred the mixture with the wooden spoon her mother had used every day of her life. Something in the world was still alive. Something still needed care, so she had cared for it. The pack had its own rules about a lone Omega without family. Within weeks, her hair had become a subject for the council. Her father's death, her uselessness as a hunter, her age, her cooking, her quiet manner. Eventually, Borak had made his ruling. She would live in the pack house, not as a daughter, not as a ward, as settlement, as payment, as a debt with a name. The pack house had once been a trading lodge built by humans decades earlier. When the valley still had logging roads, the wolves had taken it after the loggers left. They had expanded it until it became something closer to a fortress than a home. Thick timber beams, stone chimneys along the outer walls, wide porches that wrapped the building like watchful arms. She had lived there for 2 years. She had never once felt like part of it. Her room had not really been a room. It had been a narrow storage space beside the kitchen where sacks of flour and dried herbs leaned against the wall, a thin mattress on the floor beside the pantry door. The warmth from the kitchen had bled through the wall in the evenings. The mattress had smelled of cedar and old grain. It had been warmer than the cabin she had lost. Warmth was not the same as belonging. She had woken before the rest of the pack every morning. The kitchen had been the only room in the building where she could breathe without being watched. The stone hearth was wide enough to roast a whole elk. Cast iron pots hung on heavy hooks above the flames. Cooking under Stalfang rules had been nothing like what her mother had taught her. The pack had valued quantity, strength, fuel, heavy stew, coarse bread, roasted roots. A flavor was unnecessary. Flavor was performance. She had learned that lesson on a cold evening during her first winter in the pack house. She had found a small bundle of wild thyme while gathering firewood near the forest edge. The scent had ambushed her. It had smelled like her mother's kitchen. She had not asked permission. She had crushed a few leaves into the venison stew. Just a little. Just enough to bring broth alive. For 45 minutes the kitchen had smelled like a home that no longer existed. Then the door had opened. Borak had walked in. He had crossed to the hearth. He had lifted the lid of the pot. He had inhaled once. His golden eyes had moved to her. What did you add? She had swallowed. Just time. He had picked the heavy pot off its hook by the rim with bare hands. He had carried it outside. He had emptied the stew into the frozen dirt. 30 wolves had eaten something else that night. When he had come back, his voice had held the quiet irritation of a man correcting a child. Food isn't performance. You cook what the pack requires, not what you think it should be. She had lowered her eyes. She had not answered. After that night, she had cooked exactly what was expected. But late at night, after the pack had finished eating, she had sometimes experimented with the leftover scraps. The kitchen had become her one small laboratory, the one place in the building where the world had still felt alive. Outside the pack house that winter, the valley had begun to grow hungry. Snow had covered the lower trails where the deer used to move freely. Some wolves had returned from patrol with empty hands. The pack house pantry had remained full. The smaller cabins scattered through the territory had not. She had noticed the thin wrists of the wolf children, who arrived at the back door for rations. She had noticed the mothers who avoided eye contact when they took their share. She had noticed the long silences that followed a poor hunting week. She had remembered something her mother had said. Feeding someone is love made visible, so she had begun to do something dangerous. When she gathered herbs from the storage cellar, she had occasionally taken a little extra, a handful of flour, a few potatoes, a small piece of dried meat. Never enough to be obvious, just enough. At night, after the pack house slept, she had wrapped the food into cloth bundles. She had slipped out the back. She had walked through the dark to the cabins where she knew the children were growing thinner. She had never knocked. She had never waited. She had set the bundles on the porch and disappeared into the trees. By morning, the food would be gone. For months, no one had known who was leaving the supplies, but the wolves receiving them had known something. Kindness leaves a trace. Wolves recognize it. Word had moved slowly through the outer cabins. Someone was helping, and eventually that rumor had reached the wrong ears. Velaskarn was the kind of wolf who collected stories the way some women collected glass figurines. Carefully, proudly, with a particular pleasure when the figurine had been previously owned by someone she did not like. She had heard the rumor from an elderly she-wolf in the dry goods store on a Tuesday afternoon. She had connected the details in less than a minute. Food, night deliveries, kitchen access. There had been only one wolf who fit the pattern. Vela had carried the story straight to Borak. She had expected praise. She had expected the alpha to call it a credit to the pack. She had perhaps imagined a small medal somewhere in her future. Borak had not been pleased. He had been insulted. The kindness performed beneath his authority, without his knowledge, had felt like a challenge to his control. Praise had been given inside his territory. Praise had not been given to him. Praise belonged to him the way the antlers of a hunted stag belonged to him. By right, he had summoned Astrid to the courtyard that evening. The entire pack had gathered. Snow had begun to fall. He had stepped forward on the porch. His voice had carried easily through the cold air. You have been stealing food from this pack. The accusation had landed like a stone dropped into still water. She had opened her mouth. He had raised one hand. You will leave Stalfon territory by morning. No Omega who steals from her pack deserves protection. The judgment had already been made. The truth had not been asked. The truth had not been required. That night, she had packed the few belongings she owned. She had stood once in the doorway of the small storage room. She had looked at the thin mattress where she had slept for 730 nights. She had not felt grief for the room. She had felt a strange, clean feeling, like air after a long fever. But what nobody in that courtyard knew, what Borak had not known when he stood on the porch and called her worthless, was that the girl walking out of his gate carried a bloodline older than his pack. A bloodline that had not shown its face in 3 generations. A bloodline that had been hunted once and remembered. Far above the trees, where the snow lay deeper, and the silence was a kind of weight, something stirred. A presence older and more dangerous than Borak's stall lifted its head. The wind carried a scent it had never noticed before. A man stood on a stone balcony 200 miles north. He had not moved in an hour. Alpha Ragnar Volkov of the Nordvar pack was 34 years old. He had ruled his territory for 9 years. He had taken it from his father in a way the council still spoke about quietly in the corners of the great hall when they thought he could not hear. He had been told since he was a boy that the mate bond would come when it came. He had stopped waiting somewhere in his late 20s. This morning a wind had come from the south. It had carried something he had not smelled before. Mate. He had not said the word out loud. He had not needed to. The certainty had arrived complete and without explanation. He had stayed on the balcony for an hour. He had not told his beta. He had not told the council. He had walked back inside. He had stood in front of the maps in the great room with his hands clasped behind his back. He had looked at the place where Stalfang Pack sat in its little valley between two ridges. He had not made a decision. The decision had already been made by something older than him. She found the cave by accident, which was the only way the mountain ever gave anything. The first night past the Stalfang border, she did not sleep. She walked until the light went gray, and then darker than gray. And then she walked because stopping was the kind of decision she could not afford to make in the dark. Her father had told her once that the cold finds the still hand first. She had been thinking about that sentence for hours. She was beginning to suspect he had meant the still mind too. By full dark she had climbed past the timberline her parents had once called the Gentle Ridge. The pines here grew thinner. The wind cut at a different angle. She could no longer feel her left thumb. She switched the sack from her left hand to her right, and forced the dead thumb under her armpit to wake it up. The wake-up hurt worse than the numb. She decided that was a kind of mercy. A cluster of dead vines hung heavily across a limestone face halfway up a steep slope. At first, the vines looked like nothing, just dry rope left over from some long dead summer. Except the vines curved outward in a way that did not match the rock behind them. She pushed them aside. Behind them was a dark mouth in the stone the size of a small doorway. She stood there for a long moment. She did not think the word shelter. She thought the word possibility. She stepped inside. The first chamber opened only a few feet before narrowing into a second passage. A faint shaft of moonlight filtered through a crack high in the ceiling. The air inside was still. Still air meant stable temperature. Her father had drawn diagrams of this in his journal. The cold of the outer world stopped at the entrance of a cave the way a polite guest stops at the threshold. She pressed her palm to the limestone wall. Cool. Not freezing. Survivable. She let her knees go. She had not let her knees go in 2 years. The pack house had never given her the luxury. She sat with her back against the rough stone and felt the trembling start somewhere under her ribs and travel outward until even her teeth were shaking. Outside, the wind began to howl. Inside the cave, the howling sounded distant, the way bad news sounds when somebody else is reading it. Sleep came the way sleep comes for animals, without permission. Without ceremony. She woke to a pale gray light filtering down from the crack in the ceiling. For a moment, she only lay there and stared at the rock above her. She had survived a night. The word survived felt enormous and almost embarrassing, like wearing a coat that did not fit. Surviving one night was not surviving. The mountain demanded preparation. She knew that the way she knew her own face. She stepped outside. The world had changed overnight. Snow lay across everything in a clean white sheet that erased every track she had walked the day before. For one bad second, she did not know which direction she had come from. Then she remembered the second thing her father had taught her about snow. Snow reveals as much as it hides. She knelt at the cave mouth. She looked at the ground. A line of small prints crossed the slope. Deer. Smaller prints beside them. Rabbit. A long stride further down. Fox. Water would be nearby. Animals did not waste their winter on dry ground. She followed the deer trail downhill until she heard the thin sound of running water. A creek wound between the rocks under a low ridge. She knelt and drank from her cupped hands. The water burned her throat going down. It burned her chest in a different way coming back up. She was alive. She was alive in a place where no one had given her permission to be alive. The taste in her mouth was very cold and very clean. She gave herself one day to mourn, sitting on a flat rock above the creek with the sun trying weakly to reach her through the clouds. She let herself remember her mother's hands. She let herself remember the lamplight in her father's study. She let herself remember the smell of the kitchen when nothing was burning. She did not cry. She had walked past crying somewhere on the trail the night before. Then she stood up. Crying was a luxury. Building was a necessity. The next weeks taught her exactly how thin the line was. She found wild persimmons that had dried on the branch from autumn and not yet been taken by the birds. She found watercress along the creek banks where the water had not yet frozen. She found a slope of hickory trees on the south side of the ridge where the snow melted faster. The nuts were small and bitter and required a stone to crack open. Her hand cramped from the cracking. She ate them anyway. She nearly died 3 times that month. Each time was its own lesson. Each lesson tasted like iron. The first time she slipped on an icy rock crossing the creek and cut her leg open on a stone underneath. The blood was alarming. Her dress soaked dark in a spreading bloom from knee to ankle. For a clean, panicked second, she could not think. The world went quiet in that particular way. The world goes quiet when it is about to decide something. Then her father's voice came to her from a summer she could no longer pin to a calendar. Sphagnum, little one. The pale green moss, it takes up 4 times its weight in water, and the acid in it slows the bleeding. She had crawled on hands and one good knee. She had reached the soft hummocks at the edge of a wet patch 50 yards from the creek. She had packed the wound with handfuls of the pale green moss, and bound it with strips torn from her dress. She had limped back to the cave in the dark. It took nearly 2 weeks to heal. The scar was thin and pale and ran like a small white river along her shin. She looked at it sometimes in the firelight and thought of her father's voice. "Because of him I am not dead yet." That was the sentence she said out loud in the cave one night. It was the first sentence she had spoken aloud in days. The cave did not answer. The cave never answered. The cave only listened. The second time, the temperature dropped without warning during the 3rd week. She woke in the middle of the night, with her teeth clattering against each other so hard, she thought she had broken one. The fire had gone out. The cold inside the cave matched the cold outside. She rolled out of bed and crawled to the entrance and gathered every dry leaf she could find. Pine needles, the dead vines that had once hidden the mouth of the cave. She built a nest of plant matter inside her thin dress and bundled herself under it until she could feel her own breath warming the air directly against her chest. She slept upright against the stone like an animal. By morning she was alive. By morning she had also stopped being a girl who depended on permission. There was no one to give her permission anymore. The 3rd time was the worst. She had been drinking from the creek for several days. Then one morning the water tasted wrong, salty in the back of her throat. By the time she traced the smell of rot upstream and found the deer carcass wedged between 2 rocks half a mile above her usual drinking spot, the sickness had already begun in her belly. She crawled uphill for 2 days, fever climbing, the world tilting. She found a smaller tributary that came down from higher ground. She drank from that. She made herself drink the way her mother had once made her take cough syrup with both eyes closed and a count of 3. The fever broke on the 3rd night. She woke in her cave with her throat raw and her dress soaked through, and the fire burned down to coals. She lay on the moss pallet she had made and stared at the stone ceiling and thought a single sentence very clearly. Clean water always comes from the highest source. After that, she built a small filtration system from a hollow log she found beside the creek. Charcoal from her fire, sand from a dry patch along the bank. Layers, the way her father had once sketched in the back of his journal under the heading, "What to Do." When the world goes wrong, the mountain did not stop trying to kill her. It just stopped winning every round. By the end of the 4th week, she had stopped thinking like a girl who had been thrown out. She had started thinking like a girl who had moved in. She did not want to merely survive. She wanted to live. The cave had given her shelter. The mountain had given her food. Now she would build something more. The first improvement was the fire pit. She gathered smooth river stones from the creek bank and carried them up the slope one at a time. Her hands turned red and stayed red. By dusk, she had arranged the stones into a tight circle near the center of the cave floor. She lit a fire inside the ring and watched the smoke. It rose. It curled. It slid toward the crack in the ceiling. It disappeared outside. She laughed out loud. The sound surprised her. She had not laughed in a long time. The laugh sounded a little like her mother's laugh in the photograph. She built a raised sleeping platform next. Saplings and pine boughs lashed together with strips of bark. The platform lifted her bedding above the freezing stone floor and let the heat from the fire circulate underneath. She slept warmer than she had slept in the pack house. The thought was small and bright, and felt almost like a secret she was keeping from Boraxol. She built a crude door across the cave entrance from flexible saplings woven with pine boughs. It did not seal the opening. It broke the worst of the wind. That was enough. She built drying racks above the fire pit. She hung bundles of wild thyme and mountain mint, and the bitter greens she had collected on the southern slopes. Within days, the cave smelled different. It smelled of wood smoke. It smelled of green things. It smelled of a kitchen. The first time she stood in the doorway with a basket in her hand and looked back into the chamber and saw the racks and the fire and the bed, she had a strange thought. The thought was, this place is mine. She had never had a thought like that before. Not in her parents' cabin, not in the storage room beside the kitchen, not anywhere. Mine. The word felt almost too heavy to lift. Cooking required tools. Her paring knife worked for small jobs. Boiling water required something stronger. She walked the ridges for 2 days looking for the right kind of stone. Her father had once shown her a sample of soft gray rock with a green vein running through it. This is soapstone, little one. The old settlers used to carve cooking vessels out of it. Soft enough to shape, hard enough to hold heat. She found a deposit on the north side of the ridge near a fallen oak. She knelt beside it and scratched the surface with her fingernail. The rock gave a little. She carried a flat shard of flint up from the creek and began to carve. The work took 3 weeks. Her hands blistered. The blisters burst. The blisters healed and grew calluses. Her shoulders ached from the angle. She carved 2 crude bowls, heavy, uneven, beautiful in their wrongness. She filled one with creek water and set it among the coals one evening. The stone heated slowly. The water began to simmer. She watched it for a long time. Steam rose into the firelight. She thought of her mother stirring broth on a winter evening in a cabin that no longer existed. That night, she prepared her first real meal in the cave. A rabbit from a snare she had set near the creek. Wild onions she had pulled from a south-facing slope. Dried mushrooms she had found on a fallen log weeks earlier. Crushed hickory nuts she had been saving for a reason she had not yet named. The soup simmered in the soapstone bowl while snow fell outside. When it was ready, she lifted the bowl with 2 hands. The stone was hot against her palms. She tasted the broth. She did not expect what happened. The warmth spread across her tongue, and then across her chest. Her eyes filled. She set the bowl down. She put her face in her hands. She cried for the first time since the morning she had buried her mother under the ash tree. She was not crying because she was sad. She was crying because the taste reminded her of something she had almost forgotten. The word arrived from a great distance. Home. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She laughed a small wet laugh into the empty cave. In a hole in a mountain no one knew about, in a place no pack claimed, in the silence she had built out of her own hands, a rejected Omega had cooked her first real supper. She ate it slowly. She did not waste a drop. She slept that night with her belly full and the fire low, and the wind very far away. She dreamed of her mother's hand on her hair. When she woke, she did not feel haunted. She felt fed. Have you ever stood in a room you made with your own hands and felt the strange embarrassment of being proud of yourself? Astrid would not have been able to name that feeling. She only knew that something in her chest had begun to take up more space than it had before, like dough rising under a cloth. The first time Eivor Karsk smelled her bread, he was looking for watercress. He was 72 years old. He had a beard the color of wet ash. He walked with a slight hitch in his left hip that he blamed on a bad winter 40 years ago and a worse winter 20 years ago. He had cooked in great pack houses across 3 territories before time had done what time does. He lived alone now in a small cabin 2 ridges south of the Rogueland. Nobody bothered him. He preferred it that way. He had come up the slope that morning because the watercress patch he had been visiting for 15 years was empty, picked clean. The bank was muddy with small footprints, boot prints, too small to be a man, too steady to be a child. He stood at the empty patch with his hands on his hips and made a face at the snow. Then he walked uphill. The scent reached him a mile from the cave. He stopped on the trail and lifted his face into the wind. Smoke. Then under the smoke, bread. Then under the bread, he stood very still. He had not smelled a scent like that in 20 years. He kept walking. The slope grew steeper. The smell grew stronger. He pushed aside a curtain of dead vines and stepped into a cave warmer than any cave he had ever been in. He stood in the entrance and looked. A fire pit ringed in river stone. Drying racks of herbs along the wall. A raised bed of saplings and bark. Stone bowls beside the hearth. A small limestone oven beginning to take shape near the entrance where someone had stacked rocks in a deliberate pattern. The airflow design alone made him want to whistle. He whistled. Well now. A small sound behind him made him turn. A girl stood at the cave entrance with a bundle of firewood in her arms. She was younger than he expected. Bone-thin, sharp eyes. Mouth set the way a mouth sets when its owner has stopped being afraid of strangers. He raised one hand slow. The way you raise a hand to a stray dog you do not want to spook. Easy, miss. Old wolf? Bad hip. No teeth left worth biting with. Her shoulders did not relax, but she did not run. Who are you? Ivor Karsk? Used to cook for a living. Smelled your bread. There is no bread. There is the start of one. He nodded at the small stack of rocks near the entrance. You're building an oven. She looked at the stack. She looked back at him. He could see her thinking. She was good at thinking. He liked her already. Yes, you did all of this alone. Yes. He let out a slow breath. He let his eyes wander again. The bowls, the racks, the fire, the bed. How old are you? 15. He laughed. It came out short and surprised. He had not expected to laugh today. 40 years in kitchens. I have never seen anything this smart built by a girl your age. She set the firewood down. She did not say thank you. She did not say anything. She stood beside the woodpile and watched him, the way a cat watches a stranger at a window. He gestured slowly at the soapstone bowls. You carved those? Soapstone Ridge? 3 miles north? His eyebrows went up. You walked 3 miles for a stone? 3 times. The shard kept breaking. He whistled again. Different note this time. He turned toward the small oven stack at the entrance. He squatted. He studied the way the rocks had been laid, the way the airflow would draw, the way the heat would settle. He nodded once. You have got the chamber right. Your draw is off. She walked over and crouched beside him. She was so light he did not hear her step. How you want your fire and your bread on different sides of a wall, heat over, coals under, or your crust burns and your crumb does not set. Show me. He looked at her. She was already pulling stones from the pile. He smiled into his beard. You are a piece of work, miss. I am Astrid Vesna. Pleasure. They worked for 3 hours that first day. He spoke little. She spoke less. He showed her how to angle the chimney baffle. He showed her how to seal the cracks with creek clay. He showed her how to set the floor stones so the heat would push up and around and back down again. She listened the way some people pray, with her whole body. When he stood up to go, his knees popped. He pretended they had not. I will come back, if you do not mind. Why? He thought about that. He had not expected the question. Because I have been looking for an excuse to be useful again, and I think you might be it. She studied him. She did not smile. She nodded once. Come back. He turned at the cave mouth. He reached into the satchel slung across his shoulder and pulled out a small cloth pouch. He set it on a flat stone near the door. Salt, the real kind. Use it like you mean it. He stepped out into the snow. He did not look back. He did not have to. He knew the girl was already opening the pouch. The next time he came, he brought a sack of flour. The time after that, a small iron skillet that nearly made her laugh and cry at the same time. She did not. Almost. He came every few days. He never stayed long. He never sat down. He pointed at things. He grunted approval. He grunted correction. He told one good story per visit about a kitchen he had worked in long ago. He never asked her about her family. He never asked her how she had ended up in a cave at 15 years old. He let her have the dignity of her own silence. The oven was finished on the morning of the 3rd week. It was the size of a small barrel. The chamber walls were thick. The clay seams had cured to a hard pale brown. The door was a flat slab she could lift with a folded cloth. She mixed her first proper loaf with a sourdough starter her mother had kept alive since before she was born. She fed the starter the night before. The mixture bubbled the way it had bubbled in the glass jar on the counter of a cabin that no longer stood. The bubbles were a kind of inheritance she could see with her eyes. She kneaded with the heel of her left hand, her mother's way. The oven came to temperature. She slid the loaf in. She sealed the door with the slab. She sat down on the stone outside and watched the snow fall. Eivor was watching too. He had walked up that morning without telling her he was coming. He sat on a different stone with his hands on his knees and said nothing. The smell began about 20 minutes in. Warm yeast, toasted grain, wood smoke. Something underneath those things that did not have a name. He looked at her sideways. He frowned. Miss, yes. What is in that starter? My mother's. That is not an answer. It is the only one I have. He looked back at the oven. He was quiet for a long time. That smell is going further than it should. She did not understand what he meant. She did not ask. The loaf came out 40 minutes later. The crust crackled in the cold air. The inside was soft and pale and warm. She broke it open and gave him half. He chewed slowly. He closed his eyes. He opened his eyes. He looked at her with something that might have been awe and might have been worry. With old men, sometimes those two feelings live next door, miss. Yes. You ready to feed people with this? She thought of the thin wrists. the mothers who would not meet her eye, the pups asleep on the floor of cabins where the fire had been let down to save fuel. Yes, he nodded once. He did not say anything else. He stood up. His knees popped again. He pretended again. That was the beginning of the bread. She baked 3 more loaves the next morning, 5 the day after that. The rhythm of her days changed. Mornings she gathered water and herbs and hickory nuts. Afternoons she kneaded and fed the fire and tended the starter. Evenings she carried bundles of bread down the trail through the dark. She did not bake for herself. She baked for the valley. She walked the long way through the timber so her tracks would not lead back. She left loaves wrapped in cloth on the porches of cabins, where she remembered a thin pup. She left 2 loaves at the home where the widow whose mate had died last winter was raising 3 small ones alone. She left 1 at the door of the old wolf who could no longer hunt and who had once given her a wooden whistle when she was 7. She never knocked. She never waited. By morning the bread would be gone. By the next night she would do it again. The wolves who received it did not know who she was. They knew only what they tasted. Word moved the way word always moves. Quiet at first, then less quiet. They called it moon bread, because no one ever saw the baker. Because the loaves appeared in the dark. Because the smell of it on the porch when they opened their door at dawn felt like something the moon itself had left as a gift. By the 2nd month the rumor had reached 3 packs. By the 3rd month, the rumor had reached further than that, 200 miles north. The wind brought the scent to a stone balcony, where a man had been waiting for a sign without admitting to himself that he was waiting. Ragnar Volkov stepped outside on the night of the first hard freeze of February. He had not gone out for air. He had gone out for the same reason he had been going out for weeks, to check the wind. He had stopped pretending to himself that this was a habit. He knew what it was. He had simply not yet said the word out loud. The scent came stronger this time. Brevard, smoke, the underthing. His wolf surged inside his chest with a force that nearly took his knees. Mate. He stood at the balcony rail with both hands gripping the stone. The cold did not register. He inhaled until his lungs hurt. He held the breath. He let it out slow. He turned and walked back inside. He woke his beta. He did not raise his voice. I am going south. His beta blinked at him in the dark. The beta was a careful man. He did not ask the question that wanted to be asked. He asked the question that was safe. For how long? Until I find her. The beta did not need to ask who her was. He had been a beta long enough to know. He nodded once. The council will ask. Tell them I am hunting. He left before sunrise. He traveled the way alphas of his line had traveled for generations. On foot. In fur where the terrain allowed. He crossed the first ridge by noon. He crossed the second by dusk. He ate when he had to. He slept when he had to. He did not stop because he wanted to. He stopped because the body required it. The scent grew stronger the further south he traveled. By the 4th day he could pick it out of the wind without lifting his head. By the 6th day he understood that the smell was coming from a specific point on a specific ridge between 2 specific valleys he had only ever seen on maps. By the 8th day he crossed the border of Stalfang territory at night. He did not announce himself. He did not pay the courtesy of a high alpha entering another alpha's land. He walked through the timber like a man who had decided what he was, and what he was had nothing to do with manners. He reached the foot of the Rogue Mountains on the morning of the 9th day. The smell was so strong now it felt like an instruction. He shifted back to human form at the base of the ridge. He combed his hair back with his fingers. He brushed snow from his shoulders. He did not know why he was doing these things. He did them anyway. He climbed the trail. He moved the way men move when they are about to meet something they have waited too long to meet without admitting it. He found the limestone face. He found the dead vines. He pushed them aside. He stepped into the warmth of a kitchen built by a girl he had never seen. The fire was banked low. The herbs hung dry on the racks. The oven near the entrance was still throwing heat from a morning's bake. 6 loaves cooled on a wooden board he could tell had been planed by hand. The whole cave smelled like a place a person had decided to keep. He stood in the center of the chamber and breathed. A sound at the cave mouth made him turn slow. A girl stood in the doorway with a bundle of firewood in her arms. Thin frame, hair tied back with a strip of leather, eyes too old for the rest of her face. The scent hit him with no warning at all. Not bread, not smoke, her. His wolf went down to its belly inside his chest in a way it had never done. The word arrived complete. Mine. He did not say it. He could feel his own restraint working against him like a held breath. He kept his hands open at his sides where she could see them. He kept his voice low. I followed the scent. She did not move. The firewood was still in her arms. What scent? He thought about lying. He thought about saying bread. He decided she had been lied to enough. You. She took half a step back. He did not blame her. He would have done the same. I am Ragnar Volkov, Nordvar Pack. I traveled 9 days. I am not here to take you. Then why are you here? He thought about that. He gave her the only true answer he had. Because my wolf would not let me stay. She stood in the doorway for a long beat. Outside the snow had begun again. He could see the flakes catching in the leather strap that tied her hair back. She did not lower her eyes. He noticed that. Most Omegas in the presence of a high alpha could not help it. She did not look away. She set the firewood down inside the door. She kept her body angled between him and the bread. You will not touch the oven. He almost smiled. He did not. The smile would have been a kind of theft. No, you will not give me orders. No, you will not say the word mine out loud in this cave. His chest tightened in a way he had not felt since he was a young man. All right. She studied him. She studied him for a long time. Whatever she saw, she did not name it. Outside, the wind sighed against the limestone. Inside the cave, the loaves cooled on the wooden board. A man who had walked 9 days stood with his hands open in front of a girl who had walked alone into a winter storm. Neither of them moved. It makes you wonder how often the people we throw away end up holding the warmest room in the country. It makes you wonder what the world would look like if we tried to find out before we threw them. She nodded at the bench by the wall. The nod was small. It was permission, and it was offense at the same time. Sit. He sat. Ragnar did not stay the night. He slept on a flat patch of stone outside the cave under his own coat. He did not ask to come in. She did not invite him. He understood what the bench inside had meant. It had meant later. It had not meant now. She watched him through the gap in the woven door before she banked the fire, the shape of his shoulders against the snow, the deliberate stillness of who had decided, somewhere along the trail, that he would earn the chair before he sat in it. She slept badly. She woke twice. Each time she sat up and listened for the sound of him leaving. Each time she heard nothing because he was not leaving. Each time she lay back down and stared at the ceiling and asked herself a question she could not answer. Why did I let him stay? She did not have a clean reason. She had the bond. She had the way her own wolf had not flinched. She had the fact that he had asked permission with his hands open and a coat full of snow. None of those answers felt like enough. All of them felt like too much. Morning came slow. The fire was low. She fed it. She fed the starter. She mixed the morning's dough. She moved through her routine the way a soldier moves through a drill. Hands knew. Mind elsewhere. She heard him stand up outside. She heard him brush the snow off his coat. She heard him walk to the creek and break the thin ice and drink. She heard him come back. He did not enter the cave. He sat on a stone outside and waited. She breathed out. She picked up 2 cups. She filled them from the small pot of nettle tea she had set steeping on the fire. She walked to the door. She handed him one. He took it slow. The cup looked small in his hand. Thank you. You did not leave. No. Why? He thought about that. He took a sip first. He looked at the steam. Because if I left, I would only come back. She sat down on a different stone. Not close to him. Not far. The kind of distance 2 people pick when they are deciding what they are going to be. You are an alpha. Yes. You rule a pack. Yes. You walked 9 days because of a smell. Yes. She studied him over the rim of the cup. That is either very romantic or very stupid. He did not flinch. It can be both. She almost laughed. She did not let herself. The morning was too thin. The laugh would have cracked something she was not ready to crack. She set the cup down on the stone beside her. She pulled her sleeves over her wrists. She did not look at him when she spoke. My mother told me to run north. When? Once. When I was 10 or 11. She thought I was asleep. He went still, in a way she could feel without looking. Did she say why? No. Did she say east? She turned to him then. She said not east, never east. The cup in his hand stopped on its way to his mouth. He set it down on the stone beside his boot. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes did. He looked like a man who had just been handed half of a map he did not know he was missing. Astrid? What? That instruction is older than your mother. She felt the small hairs on the back of her neck lift. She did not understand the lift. She trusted it. What do you mean? He chose his words carefully, the way a man walks across a frozen pond. My family. My line. We were told a story when we were boys, about a kind of wolf the pack used to protect a long time ago. before the wars, before the ridges were divided. The story went that this kind of wolf could feed an entire pack stronger than it was just by feeding it. She did not move. We were told that the eastern packs did not see them as a gift. They saw them as a resource. They hunted them. The northern lines protected them. What did you call them? He looked at her. He said the word slow. He said it the way a man says a name out loud. For the first time in years, Moon Lunas. The cup of tea on the stone beside her went very quiet. She felt the word land somewhere deep in her chest, the way a struck bell goes on ringing under the surface long after the sound has stopped. She did not say anything for a long time. He waited. She watched the steam off her cup. My mother used that word once in a song when she was kneading. I thought it was a child's word. He did not answer. He did not need to. She stood up. She walked to the cave mouth. She looked down through the trees at the valley below. The smoke from Stalvang was a thin smear against the morning. The world she had been thrown out of looked very small from up here, smaller than it had ever looked from inside. She spoke without turning around. How sure are you? I am sure of the story. I am not sure of you. That is honest, you asked. She nodded once. She kept her back to him. The wind came up the slope and lifted the hair at the nape of her neck. Tell nobody. All right, not Ivor. All right, not your beta. All right. She turned around. She walked back to her stone. She sat. She picked up her cup. Her hand was steady. She wanted to remember that later. The hand had been steady. I have bread to bake. I will haul water. You will haul water. Yes. He stood. He picked up the empty wooden bucket beside the entrance. He walked down the slope toward the creek. He did not look back. He did not need to. The bucket was the chair. He had earned it. The day moved on. The dough rose. The fire breathed under the oven. The loaves went in. The loaves came out. He hauled water. He brought firewood. He did not enter the cave without being asked. By dusk, her shoulders had dropped half an inch. She had not noticed they had been up. It was on the third morning of his stay that the scouts came. They came through the timber the way Stalfan scouts always came. Spread out, quiet, boots placed careful. 4 of them. She heard the snow break under the third one before they were within sight. Ivor had taught her how to listen to a forest. The forest had been telling her for an hour that the forest was no longer alone. She straightened beside the oven. She put down the wooden paddle. She did not look at Ragnar. She did not have to. He had already stood up. He had already set the bucket down. He moved into the open space between the oven and the cave mouth and stopped there. He did not put himself in front of her. He put himself beside her. The difference was small. The difference was everything. The 4 scouts stepped into the clearing. They saw the oven first. They saw the loaves cooling on the wooden board. They saw the smoke. Then they saw her. The young one in front opened his mouth without thinking. No way. The second one shook his head slow. That is the Omega Borak threw out. The third one looked past her at the man standing beside her. The third one was older. The third one had been a scout long enough to know an alpha when he saw one even out of fur. The third one went pale. That is Ragnar Volkov. The young one's mouth closed. The young one's mouth opened again. Nothing came out. She stepped forward 1 step. She kept her hands open at her sides. She kept her voice flat. She kept her chin level. You have come a long way to stare at bread. The third one cleared his throat. We were sent to find a baker. Then you found her. You. Yes. The young one rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at the loaves on the board. His eyes flicked away. My sister ate this bread last week. The second one shifted his weight. My mother. 2 loaves. The 4th scout, who had not spoken yet, looked at the ground. My boy. He sleeps through the night now. She did not feel triumph. She felt something stranger. She felt seen, not as a baker, as a person who had been in their kitchens without ever standing in them. The third one straightened. He did not look at Ragnar. He looked at her. We have to tell the Alpha. I know. He will come. I know. The third one nodded once. He was a man who took orders. He was also a man who had eaten her bread. He did not say which of those was heavier. He turned. The other 3 followed. They moved back into the timber the way they had come, quieter this time, as if they were unsure who they were quiet for. When the last of them had gone, she let her shoulders drop again, not from relief, from the weight of what had just been agreed to without being said. Ragnar spoke without turning to her. How long? 2 days, maybe 3. He will not come small. No. You want me to send for my pack? No. He turned to her then. She did not look at him. She was watching the place in the timber where the scouts had disappeared. Astrid, if I bring your pack up this mountain, I become a pack. I do not want to be a pack. I want to be a bakery. He was quiet for a long moment. You understand what you are saying? Yes. You are choosing to be unprotected. I am choosing to be chosen. The wind came up the slope again. The trees moved. She watched a single dry pine cone fall from a branch and roll 3 feet downhill before it caught on a root and stopped. He nodded. He did not argue. He went back to the bucket. Ivar came up the trail that evening with a sack of rye flour and the news already on his face. He did not ask how the scouts had gone. The scouts had been gone for hours and the valley had a way of moving information faster than feet. He set the flour down inside the cave. He looked at Astrid. He looked at Ragnar. He let out a long whistle through his teeth. Well now, that is a fine pair of complications. Astrid did not smile. He is not a complication. Ivar looked at her sideways. Miss, he is the largest complication I have ever met. Ragnar almost laughed. He swallowed it. Ivar sat down on the bench by the wall. He let his bad hips settle. He looked at the fire. He looked at Astrid. How much have you told him? About what? About what you are. She glanced at Ragnar. Ragnar did not look back at her. He was giving her the room. She turned back to Ivar. Some. Ivar nodded slow. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He took out something flat and small wrapped in oiled cloth. He set it on the bench beside him. He unwrapped it. It was a notebook the size of a man's hand. The cover was dark with age. The pages were the color of weak tea. I brought this. Took me 3 days to find it. Old habit. I keep things. Astrid stepped closer. She did not pick the notebook up. She looked at it. What is it? Notes I copied down 40 years ago from a cook who worked the Eastern Range when I was young. He was a strange man. He had stranger methods. I never used them. They did not work for me. Why are you showing me? He tapped the cover once with one finger. Because of the way you press dough with the heel of your left hand. I have only ever seen one other person do that, and he had stranger methods. She picked the notebook up then. She held it carefully. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting inside was tight and slanted and brown with time. She did not read the words. She looked at the shape of them. The shape was the shape of an instruction. She closed the notebook. She held it in her lap. He died. The cook? Yes. How? Eivor looked at the fire. The pack he worked for stopped wanting him fed and started wanting him useful. He went east on a hunting trip with 5 of their warriors. Only 4 came back. She did not speak for a long time. Eivor stood up. He winced. He pretended not to. I am not telling you this to scare you, miss. Why are you telling me? He looked at her. Whatever he had been about to say, he changed it. Because the man on the porch in your valley is the small problem. The big problem is what happens when news of you travels further than this ridge. The cave was very quiet. Ragnar spoke from where he had been standing. His voice was low. It already has. Eivor looked at him. Ragnar did not elaborate. He did not need to. The look between them was a sentence with no words in it. Eivor sighed. He patted Astrid once on the shoulder. He did not say anything else. He went back down the trail in the dusk. She sat by the fire for a long time that night with the notebook in her lap. She did not open it. She held it. She thought of her mother whispering in the dark. North, never east. She thought of the strange brown ink she had not yet read. She thought of the man hauling her water who had walked 9 days because of a smell. She slept by the fire. She did not bank it down. She wanted the light. Boric came up the mountain on the morning of the 2nd day. He came with 8 warriors at first. Just 8. Just enough to look casual. He stopped at the edge of the clearing the way a man stops at the edge of a room he is about to enter, without knocking. She stood beside the oven. Ragnar stood beside her, not in front. Beside Borac's eyes did the inventory in 2 seconds. The oven, the loaves, the girl, the man. He smiled then. It was the smile of a man who had walked into a room expecting 1 chair and found 2. Volkov, Stoll, you are far from home. I am exactly where I need to be. Borac's smile did not change. His eyes did. There was a small, flat calculation behind them. He looked at her then. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the courtyard. He looked at her like a stain he had decided to come back and finish cleaning. Astrid Vesna, you have caused quite a mess. I baked bread. You fed my pack. They were hungry. They are mine. Then perhaps you should have fed them better. A small sound came from one of the warriors behind him. It was a cough. It was not a cough. Borac's jaw did the thing she remembered. The slow tightening. You were cast out for theft. I was cast out for kindness. You disobeyed your alpha. You stopped being my alpha the moment you threw me out. The clearing went so quiet that she could hear the fire breathing under the oven. Borak looked at Ragnar. You have nothing to say to that. Ragnar did not move. I am letting her speak. She is doing fine. Borak's smile died. This is my territory, and you exiled her from it, which means she is no longer your concern. She is my Omega. She is my mate. The word landed in the clearing, the way a stone lands in still water. The 8 warriors behind Borak shifted. One of them put a hand on the haft of an axe and then took it off again before he had finished the motion. Borak did not move. His face did not move, but something behind his eyes moved very fast. He had walked up the mountain to bring back a girl. He had not walked up the mountain to start a war. He looked at the warriors behind him. He looked at the loaves on the wooden board. He looked at the oven. He looked at her again. This is not finished. It is for today. He turned. He walked. The 8 followed. The 3rd scout from the day before glanced back once at the loaves. She caught his eye. He looked away. Not in shame, in something more complicated. He looked away the way a man looks away when he has just decided something he is not yet ready to say out loud. Ragnar exhaled slow beside her. He will come back. I know. With more. I know, Astrid. What? The thing you said about choosing to be chosen. Yes. You realize the choice has to be made by them. Yes. You are not going to ask for it. No. He looked at her for a long second. He did not say what was on his face. He did not need to. He turned and walked back to the bucket. She baked through the rest of the day. She baked through the night. The starter rose faster than usual. The oven held its heat tight better than it ever had. The smell that went down the slope on the wind that night was the strongest scent of bread she had ever made. Bor came back the next morning with 30. They came up the trail in a column. Not a formation. A statement. 30 was not a force. 30 was a sentence. 30 was the way a man announces that he has remembered who he is. She heard them long before she saw them. Eivor was beside her this time. He had come up at dawn without being asked. He stood by the oven with his hands clasped behind his back and his hip cocked to take the weight off the bad leg. Ragnar stood on her other side. His coat was open. His hands were loose. He looked like a man waiting for a train. Behind the 3 of them, in the snow at the edge of the clearing, 6 wolves from the valley had quietly arrived to trade for bread that morning and had simply not left. They stood under the trees. They held small sacks of venison and honey and a single jar of preserved blackberries. They were not warriors. They were witnesses. Witnesses are sometimes the most dangerous thing in a clearing. Borak stopped 20 paces out. He let the column spread behind him. He let his 30 arrange themselves into the wide half-circle that was meant to look like a court. He looked at the witnesses under the trees first. He counted them with his eyes. He filed the count somewhere behind his face. Astrid Vesna, Borak Stall, you will return with me to the valley. No, you will close this bakery. No, you will obey your alpha. You have already had this answer. He nodded once, slow. He looked at the oven. He looked at the bread on the board. He spoke without turning around. Tear it down. 2 of his warriors stepped forward. They were young. They were strong. They moved the way young, strong warriors move when an order has been given. They walked toward the oven with the steady rhythm of men who had not yet been asked to think. Then they stopped. The first one stopped first. The smell hit him at 4 paces. The smell of bread out of the oven that morning was thicker than the smell of any bread he had ever met. He inhaled without meaning to. His face did something he did not know his face could do. The second one stopped because the first one had stopped. The second one looked at the loaves on the board. The second one's mother had fed his children moonbread for 3 weeks of January. He had not known then. He knew now. Borak's voice cracked across the clearing. I gave an order. The first warrior did not turn around. His voice came out lower than he had meant it to. Alpha, what? I cannot. The silence that fell across the clearing then was not a silence of shock. It was a silence of recognition. Every wolf in the half-circle had eaten this bread. Every wolf in the half-circle had stood through the cold weeks after the delivery stopped. Every wolf in the half-circle had felt the same thinness in their belly, and the same thinness in their patience, and the same thinness in the broth at the pack house. None of them had named it. None of them had needed to. Now they were being asked to name it, by the man whose pack had grown soft on a gift he had not given. The first warrior took 1 step back from the oven. The second warrior did the same. An old wolf at the edge of the half-circle stepped forward. He was gray at the muzzle. He had been a hunter for 40 years. He had lost 2 sons in a bad winter, 12 years back. He was the kind of wolf whose voice the others listened to, because he had earned the right to be tired. He took off his fur cap. He held it in both hands. Alpha, don't. My granddaughter is alive because of her bread. Borik's jaw moved. Another wolf stepped forward. Younger, mid-20s. He had a wife and 2 small ones. He had been a sharp warrior on the patrols all autumn. My wife. She stopped crying at night sometime in January. Hurry. Did not know why. Another wolf stepped forward. Another. They were not rebelling. They were not raising voices. They were not drawing weapons. They were stepping forward one by one and saying a thing out loud they had been carrying around for months. The naming was the rebellion. Borik understood that. She could see him understanding it. He looked at her then. The look on his face was not anger. It was a thing she had never seen on his face before. It was the look of a man who had just realized he was standing on a floor that was not as solid as he had thought it was. She did not feel triumph. She felt something quieter. She felt the small, terrible mercy of a moment, going exactly the way it should go. She walked to the oven. She picked up a loaf. It was warm. It was the loaf she had pulled out at dawn. She walked back to the front of the clearing. She held the loaf out in both hands. Not to him. To the half-circle. Anyone who was hungry. The old wolf came forward first. She broke the loaf. She put a piece in his hand. He held it carefully. He did not eat it yet. He held it the way a man holds something he is taking home to share. The young father came next. Then a third wolf. Then a fourth. She broke the loaf again. She broke it again. The pieces grew smaller. Hands kept coming. Borik stood in the snow 10 paces back and watched his pack walk away from him 1 piece of bread at a time, without ever crossing the line of disrespect. Ivor stepped forward beside her. He spoke softly. Not to her. To Borik. You did not throw out an omega. Stall. Borik's eyes flicked to him. You threw out a moon, Luna. The mountains have not seen one in 3 generations, and you fed her to the rogue land. The wolves in the half-circle stopped moving. 2 of them had been about to step forward for bread. They held still. They were listening now in a new way. Borik looked at Ivor for a long beat. He did not ask what a moon luna was. He did not need to. The wolves around him had heard the same stories he had heard as a boy. The way the old stories had been told around fires that were no longer lit. He understood the word. He understood what the word meant about him. He had not just thrown out a girl. He had thrown out a thing his pack used to be told to die for. She did not gloat. She did not look at him in triumph. She broke off the last piece of the loaf. She walked to him through the snow. She stopped 2 paces away. She held the bread out. You are also hungry. I have seen it in your face all morning. His jaw worked. He did not move his hands. She set the piece of bread on the flat top of a snowdrift between them. She turned. She walked back to the oven. He stared at the piece of bread on the snow. The wolves of his column stared at it too. He did not take it. He did not knock it away either. He simply turned. He walked. The 30 followed. Some of them slower than others. Some of them looked back at the loaves and the woman and the man. Some of them did not. When the last boot had disappeared into the timber, the clearing exhaled. The old wolf walked over to the piece of bread on the drift. He picked it up carefully. He brushed the snow off it. He put it in his coat pocket. He looked at her. I will eat it later with my granddaughter. She nodded. She did not trust her voice for a moment. Eivor put a hand on her shoulder. The hand was small and old and warm through the cloth. You did that with your hands. Remember that, not with teeth. The next weeks moved fast. Wolves came up the mountain in small groups. Hunters, mates, old wolves who had not walked that far in years. They came with venison and honey and salt and dried beans and bolts of wool and a small clay jar of cherry preserves. A woman in the next valley had been saving for a daughter's wedding that had not happened. They left with bread. They left with herbs. They left with the strange and quiet feeling of a place that was not a pack, and was not a market, and was not exactly a home, and was somehow all 3. She built a second oven beside the first one. She built a wooden counter where the trades could be laid out. She built a roof of woven pine boughs over the trading space so the snow would not fall on the wool. Eivor came every other day. He never sat. He pointed. He grunted. He told 1 story per visit. Ragnar stayed. He did not ask to. He did not need to. He hauled water. He chopped wood. He repaired the woven door. He spoke to the visiting wolves with the same low courtesy whether they were a pack hunter or a small girl from the cabins in the valley. He never used the word mate in front of strangers. He never reached for her hand in front of strangers. He sat by the fire at night across from her, and they did not speak much. And the silence between them was the silence of two people who were no longer trying to convince each other of anything. On the night of the first full thaw, she sat outside the cave with a cup of tea in her hand and watched the valley lights flicker. The lights were more than there had been at the start of the winter. Some of them belonged to cabins that had stayed dark all autumn until the bread had begun arriving. Some of them belonged to families who had moved back to homes they had been about to leave. Ragnar sat on the stone beside her, not touching, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through her sleeve. She spoke without looking at him. "My mother told me to run north. Yes, I think I have arrived." He did not answer for a long moment. Then he stood up. He walked around in front of her. He went down onto one knee in the snow. She went very still. He did not reach for her hands. He did not say her name. He looked up at her with the same steady, patient face he had worn that morning. She handed him the cup of nettle tea. "May I stay?" She set the cup of tea down on the stone beside her. She thought of her mother's voice in the dark cabin a lifetime ago. She thought of her father kneeling beside the small white mushrooms on the log. She thought of the piece of bread the old wolf had taken home to his granddaughter. She thought of the loaves she had not yet baked. She nodded once. She did not trust her voice. She did not need her voice. He stood up. He sat back down on his stone. He looked at the valley with her. After a while, she leaned her shoulder against his arm. Not a fall, a choice. Somewhere on the wind moving down the slope that night, the smell of fresh bread crossed the valley one more time. It crossed the porches where the pups were sleeping warm, and the kitchens where the mothers were finally setting the table, without counting the spoons. It crossed the courtyard of the pack house, where a man on a porch was sitting in a chair, with his hands on his knees, and the truth on his face. It crossed the ash tree on the hill above an empty cabin, where two graves had grown soft under 2 winters. She thought of her mother. She thought of the word that had carried her here. She did not say it out loud. She let the wind carry it for her, north. Now, I want you to sit with a hard question for a moment. How many people in your own life have you been quick to dismiss as not worth feeding? Not bread, time, attention, the benefit of the doubt. Astrid Vesna was 15 years old. She had no pack. She had no protection. She had a jar of starter and a paring knife and a photograph of a woman under a tree. And the man on the porch decided that was nothing. He was wrong. The mountain knew. The bread knew. The wolves who came in the night and ate it on their porches knew. There is a kind of strength in this world that does not need to raise its voice. It only needs to keep the oven lit. The people who throw you away rarely understand what they are losing until the smell of it drifts back to them on a wind they cannot ignore. A man's true measure is not how he handles the powerful. It is how he treats the ones who have no power over him. Boric Stahl had power that morning in the courtyard. He had 63 pairs of eyes watching him. He had the porch. He had the railing. He had a girl in oversized boots and a thin dress, and a canvas sack she could carry in one hand. He chose what he chose. The mountain remembered. The valley remembered. Eventually, his own pack remembered too. That is the slow justice of the world. It does not come fast. It comes complete. The things our parents leave us in quiet matter more than we know when they leave them. A jar of starter, a whispered direction in the dark, a way of pressing dough with the heel of the left hand, a field journal full of drawings of moss and pine pitch and yarrow, a photograph under a flowering tree. None of those things looked like an inheritance the morning Astrid walked out of Stalfang. By the end of the winter, they had been the only inheritance that mattered. Astrid did not build a pack. She built a place. She did not demand loyalty. She baked bread and let the loyalty walk up the mountain on its own 2 feet. She did not ask anyone to choose her. She made it possible for them to be chosen by something better than fear. That is a quieter kind of leadership than the kind they tell stories about. It is also the kind that lasts. If you've ever been underestimated by people who could not see what you were carrying, if you've ever been told you were worth less than what you cost to feed, if you have ever walked out of a gate with a small sack in your hand and a colder mountain ahead of you than you had any right to survive, then you already know what Astrid Vesna learned the hard way that winter. The people who decided you were nothing were never the ones who got to decide who you became. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been thrown away by someone too proud to see your worth? Have you lived long enough to watch them realize what they lost? Somewhere out there tonight, a young person is sitting in a cold room with a jar of something their mother left them. They do not know yet what it is for. They need to hear your story. They need to know what happens when you keep the starter alive. Keep the starter alive. That is the whole thing. That is the only thing. The fire in the cave burned low. The wind moved down the slope. The bread cooled on the wooden board for whoever climbed the trail at dawn. And in a valley 2 ridges south, the first of the porches in the smaller cabins lit a lamp in a window that had stayed dark a long time. The mountain had chosen. The mountain did not change its mind.